Welcome back to Outward Home Learning. This is computer science, and today you're looking at factors that affect CPU performance. So there's quite a lot to this topic. We're going to go obviously over to Mr. Holton to start us off, tell us a bit of that information, and then you've got some tasks to complete. So straight over to Mr. Holton.
We know that the CPU is one of the most important components in the computer, so it should follow that if we can improve the way that the CPU can get through a program, then our computer should improve. It should go faster, it should respond better, it should just be a better computer if we can improve CPU performance. And there's three key ways we look to do that. I'm going to talk about all three. The first thing that we can do is we can improve a CPU's clock speed. And when I say improve, I really sort of mean buy a new CPU which has got a faster clock speed. Now, clock speed is measured in hertz, okay? That's the it's abbreviated as Hz there, and hertz is how many fetch, decode, execute cycles you can get through in a second. So take a look at the animation on the right there. If I've got a processor which has got 1 hertz and I'm getting through, let's say we're going to use 4 instructions. Okay, so 4 instructions, 1 hertz, 4 instructions. It can process 1 in a second. How long do you think that should take? Well, of course, it takes what? It takes 4 seconds. Makes sense, doesn't it? So we've got 4 instructions, 1 instruction a second, so it takes 4 seconds. However, if I get a CPU which has got 2 hertz, I'm still processing the same amount of instructions here, so 4 instructions, but it's 2 hertz. Have a look at the animation on the right now. It takes 2 seconds, okay, because I can process them twice as fast. So I'm improving the performance of my CPU by increasing the amount of times I can go around the fetch, decode, execute cycle in a second. And so modern processors now are measured in gigahertz. So you're talking about billions of cycles a second. And that can be sometimes across multiple cores, which is what we're going to talk about next. So the other thing that we can have a look at is the number of cores which are on the processor. And what I want you to imagine is that I've got a CPU which is at 1 hertz, so it could only perform sort of 1 cycle in a second. However, I've got 2 cycles going on at the same time. Okay, so I've got 2 different cores which are doing 2 cycles at the same time. And if I'm still doing my 4 instructions up here, if I'm still focused on my 4 instructions, let's see how fast that goes, how fast it gets through it. And it's 2 seconds again, so 2 cores would be 2 seconds. So it's the idea that I can process instructions simultaneously or at the same time, and if I can do that, if I do that with 2 cores or 4 cores, then I can process things much faster. I can process a program much faster just because I've got more going on at the same time. So number of cores is definitely a way we can improve a CPU as well. Finally, the last one we've got is cache size. Now this is a little bit more complicated to explain, but let's just have this quick diagram. So you imagine that I've got a CPU, and I always do a CPU as a box. So there's a CPU there. I'll label that so we remember what it is later. Cache, I'm going to do that as a box as well. So cache is a form of memory, so it stores data and instructions, and I'm going to put some letters in to represent that in a moment. And then here is RAM. Okay, RAM's much bigger than cache. But it has a problem, which we'll come on to in a minute. All right, so cache, we've got parts of a program. I'm going to represent these as letters. It's got A and B, and then RAM's going to hold the rest of that program, so C and D, and we'll bung in letter E there as well. And before I start this, I'm going to throw some time figures out there, but they are completely made up. They're not correct for modern processors, but they just demonstrate a point. So let's say the CPU wants to get letter A. It's going to get from letter A, and let's say it takes, 1 millisecond to access cache. And so the data is returned to the CPU, and that takes 1 millisecond to access it. But then let's say the CPU needs letter C. Well, that's a problem because RAM is much slower than cache to access. So that's going to take 1,000 milliseconds to access. And it can be that order of magnitude sort of slower. So that is a big problem because your CPU has to wait around for ages to get data from RAM. So if I increase the size of cache, then I can fit more of the program into cache, and that's a faster form of memory, so the CPU won't have to wait around as much. So if I make my cache bigger here, I can put more of the program in there. So let's say I'm going to put letter C now. Letter C and D are going to go from RAM, and they're going to be moved into cache, which is that faster form of memory. And that means in this example, if I've got more cache, actually I can now get my letter C from cache, and that only takes 1 millisecond, and the CPU is not waiting around, so that's a better situation. So cache size is important because it's all about how fast that the processor can access memory. And if I have a larger cache, then on average I'm going to go to cache more often, and that's going to speed up the whole running of the program as well. So they're the three things that can improve your processor performance. You've got clock speed, number of cores, and cache size.
So for your first task, you need to complete some statements and you need to say whether they are basically true or false. So this might not take you the full 10 minutes, but it should take you a fair amount of time because you're going to need to consider each of these. And if you need to go back to Mr. Halton's video, obviously you can do that. So 10 minutes starting now. Okay, that's time up on that task, so we're now going to Mr. Barnes, who's going to review those answers for you.
Okay, let's have a look at this activity about factors affecting CPU performance. So it is a simple true or false. You need to read the statement and decide whether it's true or false. So we've got a quad-core processor is always quicker than a dual-core processor. Well, you'd think it would be true, but it's not. It's false because there's other factors that affect the speed of a processor, such as the clock speed and the cache. And also, it depends whether the programs that you're using are designed to work on multi-core processors. So cores are independent processors in the CPU that work at the same time. Well, that's true. Okay, so if you've got a dual core processor and a single core processor, it's effectively got two processors within that can work independently of each other. So then we've got all software programs are designed to work on multi-core processors. Well, that's false, and therefore that is a limiting factor on the number of cores improving the speed. So we've next got tasks that the CPU need to do are split between the cores in a multi-core processor. This is called parallel processing. Well, this is true. So the idea would be if you've got a multi-core processor, each core can take some of the load, and that means they can be processed at the same time. So that leads nicely on to the next one, which is parallel processing enables multitasking. Well, that's true because processing can take place at the same time. Let's move these up a little bit. So we've now got cache memory stores data that isn't needed by the CPU. Well, that is false. Cache is very fast memory, quicker than the RAM, that's part of the CPU, which the CPU stores instructions that it commonly needs or will need in the near future to access it really quickly. And that answers the next one, doesn't it? So cache memory is located far away from the CPU. Well, that's false as well. Okay, it is part of the CPU. So we've got increasing the cache memory will improve the performance of a CPU. Well, that is true because that means that the CPU has to fetch less data and instructions from the RAM. It can store them in the cache. Next we've got the higher the clock speed, the better the performance of the CPU. Well, that is true, because if you increase the clock speed, that means it can process more instructions per second and therefore will operate quicker. And that leads on to the next one, which is clock speed represents a number of instructions that can be processed in a given time. Well, that is true as well. And then last but not least, then we've got the clock speed of a CPU is usually measured in megahertz. Well, that's false. These days we are dealing with gigahertz for processor speed, which means a 1 gigahertz processor can do 1 billion processes per second. And there's your answers to the true or false.
So now it's the exam part of your lesson. You've got 3 exam questions, all 2 marks each to complete, based on different factors that affect CPU performance. You've got 10 minutes starting now. So that's time up. As ever, we're going to Mr. Barnes to review the answers. Please make sure you correct them as you go if you need to. Over to Mr. Barnes.
Right then, let's have a look at these questions about factors affecting CPU performance as part of our deliberate practice. So we've got Kerry wants to buy a new computer, but she does not understand what the different parts of the computer do. Kerry's looking at two computers, one has a single core processor and the other has a dual core processor. Explain why having a dual core processor might improve the performance of the computer. 2 marks. So, explain why is you need to make your point, what is different between a dual core and a single core processor, and saying why that would improve the performance. So here we go. So a dual core processor has 2 cores compared to 1 in a single core processor. This means parallel processing can take place and 2 processes can be completed at the same time. Okay, so I reckon that's a 2-mark answer. Let's go on to the next question. So we've got one computer has 64 kilobits of cache and the other has 512 kilobytes of cache. Explain how cache size can affect the performance of the CPU. So we've got 2 marks. So we need to say what cache does and how that affects performance. So I'm going to say cache stores frequently used instructions by the CPU. Okay, so that's what it does, and then I'm going to say having more cache means it can store more instructions, and this means that the CPU has to fetch from the RAM less as this is slower. Okay, so there's my next answer. I'm going to look at the third one and then we'll go through the answers. So we've got here one computer has a clock speed of 2.8 gigahertz, the other has a clock speed of 3.5 gigahertz. Explain how the clock speed of a CPU affects its performance. So 2 marks. So I'm going to say the faster, or higher I should say probably, the clock speed, the faster the performance, the faster the CPU, as it can complete more fetch execute cycles per second. Okay, right, let's get ready for the answers then. So the first question was, explain why having a dual core processor might improve the performance. So I've said a dual core processor has 2 cores compared to 1 in a single core. So dual core is 2 cores. Okay, so there's 1 mark. This means parallel processing can take place, which actually already gets me the 2nd mark. And then I've said, and processes can be completed at the same time. So I said, which means each processor. So I've almost said too much. What else could we have said? So we could have said, as I say, which means each process can execute a separate instruction at the same time. We could have said which enables multitasking. We could have also said that it doesn't always improve the performance of the CPU because some processes or software can't be split between the 2 cores, so it can't increase performance. Okay. And there is my 2 marks. So the next question then was explain how the cache size can affect the performance. So let's get this up. So we've got here, I've got cache stores frequently used instructions by the CPU. So cache stores frequently use or next instructions to be used by the CPU, so that's 1 mark. Having more cache means it can store more instructions, and this means that the CPU has to fetch from the RAM less as this is slower. So I've said that can be accessed faster than accessing them from the RAM. So I've said it's quicker from the cache than the RAM, so that gets me my 2 marks. We could have said which means more cache improves the CPU performance. Too much cache can be detrimental, so we could have gone the other way, as it will take longer to find the instructions in the cache. So you could have talked about how it doesn't positively affect the performance, but actually could be negative. And then last but not least then, just move this down. So we've got explain how the clock speed of the CPU affects its performance. So we've got here clock speed. The higher the clock speed, the faster the CPU run. So the faster, the higher the clock speed, the faster the CPU. So that's 1 mark. As it complete more fetch execute cycles per second, where it represents the number of fetch execute cycles that can be done in a second. Perfect. 2 marks. And there are your answers for factors that affect CPU performance.
And that's everything you need to know about the different things that affect how well a CPU performs. Well done for taking part, and we'll see you next time.